From ABC News, World News Sunday, here's Sam Donaldson.
Good evening. The bloody struggle in China between the hardline government and the pro-democracy students continues. We'll have the latest, even as the struggle gets underway in Iran to carve up the power of the Ayatollah Khomeini, the country's fierce leader who died late yesterday in a Tehran hospital. The Iranian parliament has named the country's president, Ali Khamenei, to replace Khomeini as the spiritual leader. But the jockeying for real political power may be just beginning. More on that later. For now, the latest from China, where the Chinese Red Cross estimates that between 2,000 and 2,500 people have been killed this weekend as the army moved in to suppress the student demonstrations. Still, the army has not gained complete control. Gary Shepard reports on this weekend's bloody action in Beijing.
It was the swift and terrible ending to the Beijing spring of 1989. Hundreds of thousands of students and workers and other hopeful Chinese citizens who, through their long demonstration for democracy, had been seeking a peaceful dialogue with the leaders of this vast nation, received instead the harshest of responses to their demands for reform and freedom. Last night, an estimated 30,000 Chinese army troops were sent into the capital to crush what the government called a small band of hooligans and gangsters. Counter-revolutionaries, the government called them, who were attempting to overthrow the communist regime that has ruled this country for the past 40 years. It is difficult not to use the word massacre to describe what happened. The military, moving in armored vehicles, smashed through barricades that had been put up by the protesters and advanced relentlessly toward Tienanmen Square, where for the past several weeks, students had been staging a sit-in demanding the resignation of hardline Premier Li Peng and an end to widespread corruption inside the Chinese government. They fired automatic weapons into crowds of citizens who, for the most part, could fight back with nothing more than rocks and bottles. They fired their weapons even as the mobs were chanting slogans like, "You are the People's Liberation Army and we are the people." They fired their weapons into groups of demonstrators that sometimes numbered in the tens of thousands. There has been no official announcement of casualties. Student leaders claim they are staggering and that the government is attempting to cremate the bodies as quickly as possible so the true number of fatalities will never be known. Some lost their lives when armored personnel carriers and troop trucks simply ran over them. Others were gunned down as they tried to resist the savage show of force. Finally, the troops reached their objective, and in a last-ditch effort, demonstrators tossed firebombs onto the tanks and armored personnel carriers as they rolled into Tienanmen Square. But it didn't take long before the Chinese army had forced thousands of demonstrators to leave their encampment and fall back toward the Beijing Hotel a short distance away. Not all of them were able to escape. Bodies of demonstrators were scattered throughout the 100-acre square, and wounded were carried away to get them out of the line of fire. The military force now holding Tienanmen Square numbers several thousand, including dozens of tanks and other vehicles which have been lined up across Chang'an Boulevard. Even late this morning, the defiant survivors were still attempting to counterattack, commandeering an ambulance, setting it on fire, and aiming it directly at soldiers who had taken up defensive positions down the street. Once again, the army opened fire on the demonstrators, and before it was over, at least 3 more civilians had been killed. Government TV later showed soldiers toppling the Goddess of Democracy statue put up by the students less than a week ago. It was declared a great victory against the counter-revolutionaries, but the announcers reading the news were both wearing black. Today, thousands of curious residents of this city were out on the streets riding past Tienanmen Square and other areas where fighting had taken place. There were plenty of reminders of the desperate struggle.
There is no question that the pro-democracy movement in this country has been dealt a stunning setback by the brutal military assault here this weekend, and it may be a long time before it recovers. But the voices of those who died calling for freedom and liberty are likely to be remembered long after the sounds of the gunfire that attempted to silence them have faded away. Gary Shepard, ABC News, Beijing.
Now let's get the latest from Jackie Judd, who's standing by live in the Beijing hotel just a few hundred yards from Tienanmen Square. Jackie, what do you see? What's the latest?
Well, Sam, it's the start of the work week here. It's Monday morning, 7 a.m. rush hour, but you'd never know it. There are just a few bicyclists out there on their way to work, but not many at all. There are still some remnants of the weekend warfare. There are burned out buses. Some are still smoldering. A tractor split in two by an advancing tank is still out there. The soldiers guarding the square are now doing their morning exercises. Some are literally running in circles. Overnight, there was a continuous movement of tanks and armored personnel carriers. Dozens at a time would leave the square. They would head east and then loop back around. It was a show of force to remind the populace that the streets of Beijing are no place to be.
Jackie, we've seen reports that the army may be massing to move against the university in the northern suburbs. Have you heard anything about that?
Sam, we understand there were some troops at Beijing University, but that was 12 hours ago. We just finished making a telephone survey of a few universities in the city, and everything is reported to be quiet.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Jackie Judd reporting live from Beijing. CBS newsman Richard Roth and his cameraman Derek Williams are free tonight after having been detained by Chinese government authorities for nearly 20 hours in the aftermath of the battle in Tienanmen Square. Both are reported to be in good condition. The events in China this weekend have sparked an immediate pro-student reaction in Hong Kong. A report on that from Mark Litke.
They took to the streets by the thousands, conservative businessmen, workers, students, shocked and outraged at the bloodbath in Beijing.
They are not our government. They're crazy. They're mad. They're murdered.
At a mass rally in a Hong Kong racecourse, speakers condemned the Chinese government as ruthless, and many wept openly during a song written in honor of China's pro-democracy movement. In only 8 years, Hong Kong will come under Chinese rule again after a century of British colonialism. China has promised to preserve Hong Kong's lifestyle for 50 years and allow local people to run Hong Kong. But that promise holds little weight here now.
No future for Hong Kong people.
As the protest continued tonight, organizers called for a day of mourning this week, but others are looking farther ahead, predicting a new exodus as local Chinese rush to get out before the Chinese government takes over in 1997. Mark Litke, ABC News, Hong Kong.
The man who now leads the Chinese government, Deng Xiaoping, gave the orders to crush the students in Tiananmen Square Saturday from a hospital where he's being treated for prostate cancer, according to official Chinese sources quoted by the Associated Press. These sources say Deng was angry and said of the students, even if they're functioning out of ignorance, they still must be suppressed. In China, Deng was quoted as saying, even 1 million people can be considered a small sum. Brad's back home, while U.S. analysts and lawmakers discussed what the Bush administration's next move toward China should be. Details from Steve Shepard.
They came from as far south as Georgia and far north as Maine. Thousands of Chinese students studying at American universities up and down the East Coast. Starting a few blocks from the White House, they marched in blistering heat towards the Chinese embassy, expressing their outrage and horror at their government's actions in Tiananmen Square.
I can't imagine there's any other government in the world which can order the military troops to shoot their own people. I think they are not human beings, just like an animal, you know.
It was much the same on the West Coast, where Chinese students protested in Los Angeles, and in the South, where they paraded in Houston. U.S. foreign policy experts were similarly angered by events in Beijing. On ABC's This Week with David Brinkley, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said there was a tragic irony in the bloody crackdown ordered by Chinese leaders.
They have killed the forces, or individuals representing the forces, that they themselves encouraged over the last 10 years, and that must have an impact.
Congressman Stephen Solarz wants the administration to recall the U.S. ambassador and halt arms sales.
I simply do not see how we can continue to conduct business as usual with a government which is using machine guns to massacre their own people.
Others, however, say the U.S. ought to maintain its presence in China to tell Chinese authorities that what they did was totally unacceptable.
Deng did what he thought he had to do to maintain his regime, his authority. He was wrong, and he will suffer because of it.
Outside China, there is little people can do to influence the Chinese government except demonstrate their outrage at yesterday's bloodshed. That they are doing in large numbers. Steve Shepard, ABC News.
While Western reporters in China are working hard and under difficult conditions to get the news to the outside world, they are performing another, more local function. They are, by roundabout means, also getting the news back to the Chinese people themselves. More on that from Cokie Roberts.
Despite the Chinese government's attempt to cut off news coverage, people in this country are seeing broadcasts of the events in China only hours after they occur. But for the Chinese, the picture is far less complete and more serene. This Chinese broadcast reported the deaths of some soldiers, but made no mention of civilian casualties and presented an image of the army as cleanup crew. Even so, millions of Chinese are able to get the straight story.
At least 1,400 Chinese are now believed dead in a bloody assault by Chinese troops early Sunday.
The news comes from here, Washington, D.C., where the government-funded Voice of America beams out the story from Beijing to all of China.
We are the most pervasive source of news for hundreds of millions of Chinese.
On average days, the Voice of America claims 60 million Chinese listeners. Now the number is likely to be far higher, and the VOA's increased its Chinese language reports to 10 hours daily. The Chinese government sometimes accuses the Voice of America of stirring up student protests, but people here say they're simply reporting to millions of Chinese exactly what's happening in their capital. For the government, that could be the most damaging broadcast of all. Cokie Roberts, ABC News, Washington.
In a moment, how the world is responding to the death of Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini.